The cold did not bother her. It was a late November day in Brookline, Massachusetts, the kind of day where the wind carried the scent of dead leaves and damp earth, a final weary sigh before the first snow. Elizabeth Vance stood beside the open grave, a figure of quiet granite carved into the shape of a 75-year-old woman. She was dry-eyed. The tears had frozen somewhere deep inside her 50 years ago, sealed away with the secrets she had kept for the man they were now lowering into the ground. Her son Daniel was a different story. He wept openly, his shoulders shaking with performative sobs that echoed the hollowness she felt in her own chest. He was propped up by his wife Chloe. Sharp, impeccable Chloe, in a black dress so perfectly tailored it seemed less like an article of mourning and more like a declaration of war. Her arm was around Daniel's waist, a gesture that looked supportive, but was in reality an act of possession. Her gaze wasn't on the casket. It was on the sprawling Vance estate that loomed on the hill behind the family cemetery. Her eyes were measuring, calculating, appraising her inheritance. An old friend of the family, a woman with a face like a crumpled tissue, drifted over to Elizabeth. "Oh, Elizabeth, my dear. Richard was such a force. The world is a lesser place without him." Elizabeth offered a small, brittle smile. "Thank you for coming, Margaret. It was good of him to finally rest." The woman's face faltered, confused by the strange choice of words. She mumbled a few more pleasantries and drifted away, leaving Elizabeth alone with the wind. He hadn't just rested. He had been decommissioned. A 50-year operation had finally mercifully come to a close. Richard had been her king, the public face of their empire, the charismatic dealmaker, the ruthless titan of industry. But a king is nothing without the strategist who moves the pieces on the board. He had been her battering ram. She had been the architect. And now the architect was free. Back at the house, the air was thick with the smell of catered food and forced sympathy. People moved through the grand rooms, their voices hushed into a respectful murmur that barely concealed their ravenous curiosity. They spoke of Richard's legacy, of his business acumen, of the void he left behind. They looked at Elizabeth with a mixture of pity and condescension. The poor, frail widow, lost without her powerful husband. She let them look. She had worn this mask for half a century. It was more familiar to her than her own face. Daniel, his eyes red and puffy, was holding court in the living room, retelling a sanitized anecdote about his father's tough but fair business practices. Chloe, ever the dutiful wife, refilled glasses and offered sad smiles, but her focus was elsewhere. Her eyes followed Elizabeth, tracking her as she moved through the crowd, a predator waiting for the weakest member of the herd to isolate itself. The moment came when Elizabeth retreated into Richard's study. It was a monument to him. Mahogany walls, leather-bound books, he'd never read photos of him shaking hands with presidents and titans. A massive, domineering portrait of him hung over the fireplace, his painted eyes seeming to follow her with the same possessive certainty he'd had in life. Elizabeth stood before it, her back to the room, feeling the weight of the gilded cage he had built around her. Or rather, the cage she had designed and allowed him to construct. The click of the door shutting behind her was soft, but it sounded like a vault ceiling. Chloe had followed her in. "Elizabeth." Her voice was a purr of manufactured concern, dripping with a sympathy so false it was insulting. "We need to talk." Elizabeth didn't turn around. She kept her gaze fixed on the portrait. "Do we, Chloe? I think so. For your own good." Chloe came to stand beside her, her perfume something expensive and aggressive, cutting through the dusty scent of old paper and leather. "Daniel and I have been discussing the future, the estate, the finances, all of this." She made a vague gesture at the room, at the house, at the 50 years of accumulated wealth. "It's too much for you now. It would be a burden." The word hung in the air. Burden. as if Elizabeth were a piece of antique furniture to be dealt with. "We think it's best." Chloe continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "If you grant Daniel power of attorney, he can handle everything. He'll make sure you are taken care of, that you want for nothing." Elizabeth remained silent. She could feel Daniel's presence at the door. He had followed his wife as he always did, a loyal dog trailing at her heels. Chloe took Elizabeth's silence as acquiescence, as the frailty she so desperately wanted to see. She placed a hand on Elizabeth's arm. The touch was cold, proprietary. "We've already been looking at some wonderful places for you. There is a lovely suite at the Beacon Hill Senior Living Facility. Top-of-the-line care, social activities. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. We would handle it all." There it was. The final elegant shiv slid between her ribs with a polite smile. They weren't just taking her money. They were taking her home, her life. They were going to file her away in a pastel-colored room, to wither and die while they lived in her house and spent the fortune she had built. She felt a tremor start in her hand, a lifetime of suppressed rage threatening to boil over. She clenched her fist, her short, manicured nails digging into her own palm. The brief, sharp pain was an anchor. It steadied her. "Mom." Daniel's voice was weak, pleading. He stepped into the room, unable to meet her eyes. "Chloe, right. It says what Dad would have wanted. For you to be comfortable, safe." That was the deepest cut. Not Chloe's naked ambition, which was something Elizabeth could understand, even respect, on a purely tactical level. It was her own son's betrayal. The weakness, the cowardice. He couldn't even voice the plot himself. He let his wife do it for him, then tried to sanctify it with his dead father's name. Elizabeth finally turned slowly. She looked from Chloe's sharp, triumphant face to Daniel's guilt-ridden one. She let the silence stretch, filling the room until it was suffocating. She watched the confidence drain from Chloe's eyes, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. She saw the sweat bead on Daniel's temple. Her gaze was flat, devoid of emotion. It was the look of a scientist observing a specimen or a general surveying a battlefield. She had spent 50 years learning to hide every thought, every feeling. It was a skill that was about to serve her well. "I am tired," she said, her voice a low, steady thing that held no trace of grief or fear. "I need to rest." She walked past them, her posture perfect, her steps measured. She didn't brush against them, didn't acknowledge them further. She simply exited the room, leaving them standing in the shadow of Richard's portrait. Chloe's smile returned, a smug little curl of her lips. Daniel let out a long, shuddering breath. They thought they had won. They thought the old woman had broken. They had no idea they had just armed a bomb. Later, when the last of the mourners had departed and a deep, oppressive silence had fallen over the house, Elizabeth was not in her bed. The house was a museum of a life she was about to dismantle. Downstairs, Chloe and Daniel were probably celebrating drinking Richard's best scotch and making plans. Their plans. Elizabeth was in her private sitting room, a space on the second floor that Chloe had once dismissed as a dusty little sewing nook. It was decorated with floral wallpaper chintz armchairs and shelves of romance novels. It was a perfect piece of camouflage. A room so aggressively feminine and quaint that no one would ever think to look closer. It was her favorite deception. She moved not to the knitting basket, but to a large, ornate mahogany bookshelf filled with classic literature. Her hand bypassed the leather-bound spines of Austen and Bronte and settled on a small carved rosette on the side panel. She pressed it in a specific sequence. There was no audible click, only the faintest whisper of movement. A section of the bookshelf books, and all slid silently inward and then to the side, revealing a wall of flat black metal. In the center was a small glowing panel. Elizabeth placed her thumb on it. A green light pulsed. Then she leaned closer, and a tiny beam of red light scanned her retina. Biometric ID confirmed. Welcome, architect. The metal wall retracted into the ceiling, revealing a room that was the antithesis of the one she had just left. It was a compact, cold command center. 3 large monitors were mounted on the far wall, their screens dark. A sleek, minimalist desk held a single keyboard and a multi-button mouse. The air hummed with the low, steady thrum of cooling fans and processing power. This was her sanctuary. This was her true office. She sat in the ergonomic chair, a stark contrast to the chintz armchair in the other room. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, and the monitors flickered to life. Not with knitting patterns, but with streams of encrypted data, global financial tickers, and satellite network maps. She brought up a simple, secure browser window. First, she checked on her daughter-in-law. A few keystrokes brought up Chloe's Instagram profile. It was a shrine to her own ambition. A photo from 2 days ago showed her clinking champagne glasses with her colleagues at Sterling Croft, the prestigious Boston law firm where she worked. The caption read, "Big things are coming. The future is female, and it's Sess wearing a power suit. Boss babe, true corporate lawyer, winning." Another photo, a selfie taken in her gleaming corner office, was captioned, "Burning the midnight oil for a case that is going to change everything." Hard work pays off. Elizabeth's expression remained neutral, but a cold fire burned behind her eyes. Change everything. You have no idea, my dear. Next, Daniel. His Facebook page was a more pathetic affair. His most recent public post from that very afternoon was a solemn-faced selfie with the cemetery in the background. The caption was a masterwork of passive-aggressive self-pity. A difficult day, laying a great man to rest. Now begins the even more difficult task of carrying on his legacy and protecting the family. Sometimes the hardest choices are the most necessary. Family duty, legacy. The long road ahead, the hypocrisy, was breathtaking, protecting the family. By casting its matriarch into a gilded cage, he was seeking validation from his online friends, framing his greed and weakness as a noble burden. This, more than Chloe's predatory ambition, made Elizabeth's stomach turn. She had no tolerance for weakness. Richard had been many things, arrogant, ruthless, cruel, but he had never been weak. She closed the social media windows. The observation phase was over. The data had been collected. The enemy's psychological state was confirmed, arrogant, overconfident, and completely oblivious. She opened a new window. The interface was stark black and minimalist. A single logo materialized in the center of the screen, a stylized representation of a shield, intricate and unbreakable. Below it, one word in clean sans serif font, Aegis. This was her creation. A private, military-grade, dark web network she had built from the ground up over decades. It was a global network of information finance and influence, with layers of security that would make government agencies weep. A command terminal blinked in the corner of the screen, a single green cursor awaiting her instruction. Her hands rested on the keyboard. There was no hesitation, no last-minute doubt. They had pushed her. They had declared war. They had forgotten who she was. She typed a single command line. Her fingers moved with unerring precision. "Initiate protocol Phoenix Ascension." She hit enter. The screen flashed. "Confirm execution YN." She typed Y. Instantly, the monitors came alive with a cascade of information. It was like watching a sleeping beast awaken. On one screen, a world map lit up with lines of light tracing the movement of vast sums of money. Funds flowed from dormant, heavily encrypted accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, split into thousands of smaller, untraceable transactions and funneled through a dizzying maze of shell corporations. They moved through digital clearinghouses in Singapore, London, and Dubai before finally consolidating in new accounts under the control of corporate entities that until 5 seconds ago had not existed. On the second screen, a list of company names scrolled rapidly. Helios Capital Partners, Orion Risk Management, Artemis Holdings, Nix Strategic Solutions. Dozens of them. Beside each name, a status indicator flashed from deep dormant to active. These were her soldiers, corporate entities with clean histories, impeccable paperwork, and nominee directors scattered across the globe, all of them ultimately answering to a single anonymous command structure. Her command structure. On the third screen, a new directive was being issued to a specific newly activated shell. A company registered in Delaware with a virtual office in Zurich. Its name was Aegis Solutions. The protocol was named Phoenix Ascension. It was fitting. They thought they were burying her in the ashes of her husband's legacy. But a phoenix doesn't die in the fire. It is reborn, and it rises. A week passed. The funeral flowers on Richard's grave wilted their petals, turning brown and brittle in the biting wind. In the Vance mansion, a new routine had settled in. Elizabeth played her part to perfection. She was the frail, grieving widow. She ate her meals in silence, while Chloe and Daniel chatted around her, their conversations a blend of feigned concern for her and barely concealed excitement for their new life. They spoke to her in slow, simple sentences, as if addressing a child. She would just nod her eyes, distant, letting them believe she was fading away. The performance was almost enjoyable. Tonight, however, the energy at the dinner table was different. It was electric. Chloe was practically vibrating with excitement, a triumphant gleam in her eyes that she didn't even bother to hide. Daniel, catching her energy, was beaming. They had opened a bottle of Veuve Clicquot, a celebration. "You are not going to believe what happened today," Chloe announced to Daniel, though her words were loud enough for Elizabeth, sitting at the head of the table, to hear clearly. She didn't care if Elizabeth heard. In her mind, Elizabeth was already gone, a ghost haunting her own home. "Don't keep me in suspense," Daniel said, pouring them both another glass of champagne. "We landed the client of a lifetime," Chloe said, her voice flush with victory. "They call themselves Aegis Solutions. They came out of nowhere, Dan. Some hyper-secretive global risk management firm. No online presence, no public profile. They headhunted us. Specifically my division at Sterling Croft." Elizabeth carefully placed her fork down her movements, slow and deliberate. Aegis Solutions. Her little seed had found fertile ground. "They want us to spearhead a hostile takeover." Chloe continued, her voice dropping dramatically. "A massive one. The target is Omnigen Tech, one of the biggest players in the AI and data analytics space. They are a public company, but the board is complacent. Ripe for the picking. Aegis has been watching them for months. They have a complete dossier. Financial weaknesses, internal power struggles, everything. My God, Chloe." Daniel breathed, his eyes wide. "Omnigen, that's huge." "It's bigger than huge," she said, taking a long sip of her champagne. "The retainer they paid us. Dan, the retainer alone, could buy this entire street, including the goddamn country club." She laughed, a sharp, triumphant sound. "This is it. This is the case that makes me a partner. A named partner, maybe. Sterling Croft and Vance. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" Daniel looked utterly enthralled, gazing at his wife, as if she had single-handedly conquered a small country. "You were brilliant," he said, his voice thick with admiration. He was so proud, so swept up in her success, he failed to see the strings attached to the magnificent prize she had been handed. He saw the money, the prestige. He saw a way to finally become the man he thought his father had been, never realizing he was just a pawn in his mother-esque game. Chloe turned her bright, victorious gaze on Elizabeth. Her smile was condescending, laced with a cruel sort of pity. "Isn't that wonderful, Elizabeth? With this kind of money coming in, we'll be able to afford the very best care for you. No expense spared. You'll be so comfortable." The implication was clear. Your new prison will be a luxurious one. From the adjoining sitting room, where Elizabeth had retired after the main course, she listened to the rest of their conversation. They were already spending the money in their heads, planning renovations for the house, a new car for Daniel, a long vacation in the Maldives. They were children dividing up treasure they hadn't yet secured. Elizabeth sat in her favourite armchair, the one Chloe thought was so pathetic. She held a delicate porcelain teacup, her hand perfectly steady. The warm ceramic was a comforting weight in her palm. Her eyes, however, were not comfortable. They were cold, sharp, and focused, like the eyes of a hawk circling high above an unsuspecting field. She watched them through the open doorway, a tableau of greed and arrogance. Chloe blinded by her ambition. Daniel sedated by the promise of unearned power. They thought they were predators who had cornered their prey. They couldn't comprehend that they were the prey, and the trap, so exquisitely designed, so perfectly baited, had just snapped shut around them. A slow, cold smile touched Elizabeth's lips, a sight no one had seen in years. It did not reach her eyes. Phase 1, the bait. Complete. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her Earl Grey tea. The game was afoot. And she was the only one who knew the rules. The silence of the Vance mansion was a living thing. It had weight. It pressed in on the ears, a constant hum of emptiness, where Richard's booming voice used to be. For a week, it had been a shroud of grief. Today, it felt like the held breath before a firing squad. The doorbell, a soft electronic chime, cut through it like a gunshot. Elizabeth didn't move from her armchair in the sunroom, the one overlooking the dormant winter gardens. She heard the housekeeper, Maria, pad down the marble hall, the soft click of the front door, opening a brief, sterile exchange of words. A moment later, Maria entered the sunroom holding a thick, cream-coloured envelope, as if it were a venomous snake. "For you, Mrs. Vance." "A courier." Elizabeth simply nodded, extending a hand that was steady, almost unnaturally so. She didn't look at Maria's worried face. She didn't need to. She could feel the pity radiating from everyone in this house. The poor, frail widow, lost and confused. She took the envelope. It was heavy, official. The return address was a law firm she didn't recognize, but she knew the sender's intent, as if it were printed in blood on the crisp paper. She waited until Maria had retreated, her footsteps fading back toward the kitchen. She slit the envelope open with a silver letter opener, a gift from Richard, from a trip to Toledo decades ago. The papers slid out, a sheaf of them, dense with the suffocating language of the law. She didn't need to be an attorney to understand the words that leaped out at her. Petition for conservatorship. Inability to manage personal and financial affairs. Significant cognitive decline. Testimony from concerned family members. Each phrase was a carefully sharpened barb designed to wound, to disorient. A declaration of incompetence. A legal execution. She read through the attached affidavits. A statement from a doctor she'd seen once 6 months ago for a routine checkup, his professional opinion now twisted into a diagnosis of senility. A written observation from a private nurse Chloe had hired just last week, a woman with kind eyes and a treacherous pen, who detailed Elizabeth's moments of confusion and long periods of vacant staring. They were painting a portrait of a ghost, a woman already gone, but it was the last page that made the air in her lungs turn to ice. It was the signature page. And there at the bottom, beneath the typed name, Daniel Vance, was her son's handwriting. the same looping, slightly impatient script she had taught him to write at the kitchen table in this very house. He had been 6. He'd been so proud of his own name. Now he had signed it to a document that would strip her of hers. The paper didn't tremble in her hand. Her breathing didn't hitch. A stranger watching her would have seen only an old woman reading her mail. But inside, a furnace door rusted shut for 50 years was groaning open. The grief for Richard, the quiet ache of loneliness, it was all incinerated in a blast of pure white-hot fury. This wasn't an act of concern. This wasn't a family trying to protect its matriarch. This was a hostile takeover. It was a battle plan. And as her eyes scanned the meticulously crafted legal arguments, the clauses and subclauses, she wasn't a victim reading her own death sentence. She was a general, finally seeing the enemy's strategy laid bare on the map. She saw the flanking maneuvers, the supply lines of false testimony, the primary assault aimed directly at her mind. A small, cold smile touched her lips, a sight that would have terrified Chloe had she been there to see it. They thought they were caging a helpless bird. They had no idea they were trying to put a leash on a dragon. Her mind, the very thing they were trying to declare broken, was already working, dissecting their attack, identifying its weaknesses, and planning a counteroffensive so devastating it would salt the earth where their ambitions grew. The petition wasn't an ending. It was a declaration of war, and Elizabeth Vance had never lost a war in her life. The smell of the thick, expensive paper, the chemical scent of the toner, it was clean, sterile, modern. But it dragged her back to a different smell. The smell of ozone and hot electronics, of concrete and stale coffee. A memory sharp and vivid, not of a gilded cage, but of a real one. The year is 1995. The room has no windows. It's a bunker, a concrete box buried beneath a nondescript office building in Cambridge. Wires as thick as pythons snake across the floor, feeding racks of humming servers that blink with a constellation of green and amber lights. A younger Elizabeth stands before a massive CRT monitor, its glow illuminating the sharp planes of her face. Her dark hair is pulled back in a severe knot. She wears a simple, functional dress, but she commands the space with an authority that makes the air crackle. A young Richard Vance, his face not yet softened by wealth and age, stands beside her, shifting his weight. He's the one in the suit, the one the world sees as the titan of industry. But in this room, he is an acolyte, waiting for instruction. On the screen is the corporate structure of a rival technology firm, a company called Omnilink. They rejected the offer again, Richard says, his voice tight with frustration. They called it predatory, arrogant. Elizabeth doesn't turn. Her eyes are fixed on the diagram on the name at the very top. Michael Corrigan, CEO. Good, she says. Her voice is calm, devoid of all emotion. It's the voice of a mathematician solving an equation. A direct acquisition is messy. It leaves infrastructure we don't need and people we don't want. We don't acquire them, Richard. She turns her head slightly, her gaze meeting his in the reflection on the dark screen. We dismantle them. She points a single elegant finger at the CEO's name. You start there. Isolate him. I've had my people digging. Corrigan's wife is a benefactor for the city's Contemporary Art Museum. A major gala is coming up in 3 weeks. We will make an anonymous 7-figure donation to the same museum, but through a foundation based in the Cayman Islands. A reporter we have on the string will get a tip. The headline won't be about philanthropy. It will be about shadowy offshore money and questions about its source. She then points to the chief financial officer on the chart. This one, the CFO, has a son with a gambling problem. A significant one. We will have one of our holding companies purchase his debt from the bookies. All of it. Then we will send a polite letter to the CFO's home, not the office, offering to forgive the entire sum in exchange for a confidential review of Omnilink's fourth quarter projections. before they are released to the public. Richard is listening rapt. This is the part of the business he never talks about, the part that truly built their empire. It wasn't his charm or his negotiating skills. It was this cold, brutal, strategic demolition. Once the CEO is mired in a public scandal, distracted and paranoid, Elizabeth continues, her voice dropping to a whisper. And we have confirmation their quarterly earnings will miss the mark. That's when we move. We use the offshore accounts to short their stock. Heavily. The bad press and the poor earnings report will hit simultaneously. The stock will crater. It will be a bloodbath. In the ensuing panic, we don't buy the company. We buy their most valuable patents out of the wreckage for pennies on the dollar. We hire their best engineers, the ones who will be desperate for a life raft. We let the rest of it sink. She finally turns to face him fully, her eyes like chips of obsidian. There will be no fingerprints, no evidence of a corporate raid, just whispers and ruin. The world will see a promising company that simply collapsed under the weight of its CEO's hubris and mismanagement. And we will own their future. Richard nods slowly, a dawning awe on his face. He is the king, the face on the magazine covers. But she is the queen, the strategist, the ghost in the machine who moves the pieces, topples the thrones, and buries the bodies. The memory doesn't feel like the past. It feels like a blueprint. The crisp, sterile scent of the legal document brings her back to the sunroom, back to 2025. She looks down at the petition in her hands. Cognitive decline. The irony is so bitter it almost makes her laugh. They have no idea what kind of mind they are challenging. This isn't a battle they've started with a frail old woman. It's a battle they've started with the architect of their own fortune, the very person who wrote the playbook on whispers and ruin. The buzz in Chloe Vance's pocket was insistent. She glanced at her phone. A calendar alert. Emergency partner meeting. 15 minutes. Boardroom. She felt a familiar thrill, a surge of adrenaline mixed with ambition. Emergency meetings at Sterling Croft weren't for bad news. They were for big news. And lately, all the big news had her name attached to it. The Aegis Solutions account was the talk of the firm, the talk of the entire Boston legal community. Landing a client that huge, that mysterious for a hostile takeover of this magnitude. It was the stuff of legend. She was already mentally redecorating her corner office, the one with the view of the harbour. She smoothed down her silk blouse, grabbed her leather-bound portfolio, and walked toward the main boardroom with the confident stride of a conqueror. Heads turned as she passed. Associates whispered. She was the new star, and she loved it. She felt powerful, in control. Not just here, but at home too. The petition was with the courier. By now, Elizabeth would have it. The final pieces of her plan were clicking into place. Soon she would have it all, the career, the Vance fortune, the control. She entered the boardroom. The air was thick with tension, a stark contrast to her own buoyant mood. The senior partners were already assembled around the long mahogany table. No one was smiling. James Sterling, the firm's founding partner, a man whose face looked like it was carved from granite, sat at the head of the table. He didn't look at her as she took her seat. He was staring at a speakerphone in the center of the table as if it were a bomb. "Thank you for joining us, Chloe Sterling," said his voice gravelly. "We've just gotten off a call with Aegis Solutions." Chloe leaned forward, a polite, eager smile on her face. "I hope they were pleased with the preliminary filings. I think we have a very strong opening strategy." Sterling's eyes finally met hers, and they were cold. They weren't. They called our strategy timid and uninspired. Chloe's smile froze on her face. The blood drained from her head, leaving a high-pitched ringing in her ears. Timid. She had proposed a legal blitzkrieg. I don't understand," she stammered. "The plan was aggressive by any standard. Not by theirs, another partner, a woman named Eleanor, chimed in. She looked pale. They've invoked a clause in the contract. Section 12, sub-paragraph B. The supreme oversight provision. Chloe's mind raced, trying to recall the fine print she had skimmed over in her haste to get the contract signed. A supreme oversight clause. It was archaic, almost unheard of in modern retainer agreements. It was a relic of a more brutal era of corporate law. They believe the matter is too critical to be managed at a distance. Sterling continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. They are dissatisfied with our progress and our approach, so they are taking direct control of the case. A cold knot of dread tightened in Chloe's stomach. What does that mean? Are they firing us? That would be catastrophic. Her career would be over. No, Sterling said, and the way he said it was somehow worse than a yes. It means the client is coming in-house. They are sending their new CEO to personally direct the takeover. From our offices. Starting Monday, the silence in the room was absolute. The implications crashed down on Chloe like a physical weight. The client, this secretive, absurdly powerful, and clearly ruthless client, was going to be sitting in her conference room, looking over her shoulder, dictating every move. Her career-making case hadn't just become a threat. It had become a live-in executioner. Her reputation, her future at the firm, her entire carefully constructed ascent, it was all now hostage to a person she had never met. The biggest win of her life had just turned into a ticking bomb, and she was chained to it. The corner office with the harbour view evaporated from her mind, replaced by the terrifying image of an empty desk. That evening, the Vance mansion was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the quiet of a chessboard. After the opening moves, the pieces set the air humming with unseen possibilities. Mia Vance Elizabeth's 16-year-old granddaughter let herself in, dropping her backpack by the door. She was the only one who didn't walk on eggshells in the house, the only one who still saw her grandmother, not a relic. She found Elizabeth in the library, sitting by the fire, a tablet resting in her lap. "Hey, Grandma," Mia said, flopping into the armchair opposite her. "How was your day?" "You didn't just stare at the wall and drool, did you?" It was their running joke, a small rebellion against the narrative Chloe was trying to build. Elizabeth looked up from the screen, a genuine warmth in her eyes that only Mia ever saw. "No drooling today," Elizabeth said, her voice dry. "I've been too busy managing my vast, crumbling empire from this very chair." Mia grinned. "Good. Don't let Mom and Dad have all the fun." She leaned over, curious. "What you looking at?" On the screen was a stock tracking application. A complex chart showed the 5-day performance of a tech company called Cygnus Innovations. It was plummeting. Mia frowned. "Cygnus, isn't that the company Aunt Chloe's firm is trying to buy?" She was bragging about it at dinner last week, said it was the biggest deal of her career. Elizabeth's expression didn't change. "Is it just some old investments Richard made? I like to keep an eye on them." Her answer was a little too smooth, a little too rehearsed. Mia's eyes, however, were drawn to something else. A small logo at the top corner of the application, a stylized geometric phoenix. She'd seen it before. She was a tech nerd, a deep diver into the worlds of venture capital startups and the shadowy megacorporations that funded them. She'd spent hours on niche tech blogs and forums. "That logo," Mia said, slowly pointing. "That's Aegis, isn't it?" Elizabeth's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the tablet. "I believe so. They manage the portfolio. Aegis Solutions." Mia pressed her mind, making connections. They're like ghost level, super secretive. They bought that AI drone company last year, and nobody even knew who the CEO was. People on the forums say they're ex-military intelligence or something. They're legends. She looked from the logo on the screen to her grandmother's placid face. A strange, impossible thought began to form in her mind. Her frail, quiet grandmother, who struggled to use FaceTime, and this legendary ghost-level corporation. It made no sense. But the logo was right there, and it was tracking the exact same company her mother was trying to destroy. Grandma Mia asked, her voice soft and innocent, but her eyes sharp with a new suspicion. "What is Aegis?" Elizabeth offered a vague, dismissive wave of her hand. "Oh, just another faceless company, dear, like all the others. Your grandfather had dealings with hundreds of them." She closed the application and set the tablet aside. "Now tell me about school. Did you finish that ridiculous physics project?" The subject was changed, but the question lingered in the air. Later that night, long after the house was dark, Mia sat in her bedroom, her laptop open. The glow of the screen illuminated her determined face. In the search bar, she typed Aegis Solutions plus Vance family. Then she typed Aegis Solutions plus Cygnus Innovations hostile takeover. And finally, her fingers, hesitating for just a second before pressing Enter, Elizabeth Vance plus Aegis Solutions. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew with a certainty that chilled her that her grandmother's vague answers were a lie. And Mia was very, very good at finding the truth. The pressure was mounting. The legal petition was a ticking clock. Chloe's ambition was a loaded gun. And now Mia's curiosity was a wild card, an unforeseen complication. Elizabeth stood in the library, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The house felt smaller, the walls closing in. For 50 years she had maintained the peace, upheld the legacy, played the part of the devoted wife. She had allowed the world to believe Richard was the king. But the game had changed. Her children were coming for her throne, and the only way to defend it was to unearth the bones she herself had helped bury. She walked to the far wall, to the grand, life-sized portrait of Richard. It had been painted a decade ago. He looked powerful, benevolent, a captain of industry. It was a beautiful lie. Her hands, steady and sure, found the edges of the heavy gilt frame. With a soft click that no one had heard in 30 years, she swung the entire painting outward on hidden hinges. Behind it was not a wall, but the cold grey steel of a high-security safe. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers danced over the combination lock, a sequence of numbers tied not to birthdays or anniversaries, but to the coordinates of places where deals were made and enemies disappeared. The heavy door swung open with a whisper of pressurized air. The interior was not filled with jewels or bearer bonds. It held only a single object, a leather-bound ledger, its dark brown cover worn smooth with time. It was the one thing she had never digitized, the one record too dangerous for any network, even Aegis. It was the physical repository of their darkest secrets, the detailed accounting of Richard's wet work, the operations too morally compromised, too illegal to ever be recorded electronically. This was the true foundation of the Vance fortune. Not stocks and bonds, but blackmail and blood. She carried the ledger to the desk, the leather cool against her skin. She sat down and opened it. The pages were filled with a complex cipher of her own design, a mixture of numerical substitutions and archaic symbols. It was a language only she and Richard had spoken. And Richard was dead. Her fingers traced the elegant coded script. She didn't need the key. The language was imprinted on her soul. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She was simply reminding herself of the weapons at her disposal. She turned a page, her eyes scanning a log entry from the late 1990s. A date. A series of coded expense reports. A final payment authorization. And then a name. She began the methodical work of deciphering the entry. The symbols resolved themselves into letters, the numbers into dates and sums of money. Her breath caught in her throat. Her blood, which had been running hot with fury, turned to ice water in her veins. The entry detailed a series of payments to a private contractor, a specialist in permanent silencing. The target was a journalist, an investigative reporter who had been getting too close to a corrupt politician, that Richard had been backing a politician who was a key asset in one of their larger schemes. The ledger was chillingly specific. It detailed the surveillance, the setup, and the final payment issued 1 week after the journalist was officially declared a missing person. And then she saw the name of the reporter spelled out in the cold, clear letters of her own cipher: Marcus Thorne. The world tilted on its axis. Marcus Thorne, the brilliant, fearless journalist who vanished without a trace in 1998. The man whose disappearance had been a ghost haunting Boston for over 2 decades. The man Chloe spoke of with a mixture of reverence and heartbreak. Marcus Thorne was Chloe's father. Elizabeth stared at the page, the truth of it, a physical blow. This wasn't just business. It wasn't just a brutal tactic from a past life. This was the original sin of the House of Vance. Her husband, the man whose legacy she had protected, whose fortune her son now claimed, had ordered the murder of her daughter-in-law's father. The woman who was trying to strip her of everything was the orphaned daughter of a man they had silenced. Chloe's quest for the Vance fortune wasn't just greed. It was a dark, twisted, unknowing quest for justice. And Elizabeth now held the one secret in the world that could either destroy Chloe completely or give her the one thing she'd been searching for her entire life, the truth. The weapon was heavier, darker, and more terrible than she could ever have imagined. The air in the Sterling Croft boardroom was a monument to expensive, understated power. A long, polished obsidian table reflected the grey Boston skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a painting of ambition. Chloe Vance stood at the head of that table, the very picture of control. Her suit was sharp, her posture impeccable. Beside her senior partners, Arthur Sterling and Julian Croft, shifted with a nervous energy, their usual gravitas replaced by the anxious excitement of a massive payday. This was it. The culmination of weeks of relentless work. The arrival of the CEO of Aegis Solutions, their whale of a client. Chloe smoothed the front of her jacket a final check. She felt a tremor of pure, unadulterated triumph. This deal, this hostile takeover, wasn't just a career maker. It was the final key. The key that would unlock the Vance fortune sideline the old woman and place Chloe and Daniel exactly where they deserved to be. At the top. Arthur cleared his throat. They on their way up, Chloe. The security detail called from the lobby. Excellent, Chloe said, her voice a low, confident purr. Let S be ready to impress. She scanned the faces of her team. They were the best. Sharks. And she was their leader. The door at the far end of the room was a heavy, dark wood. All eyes were fixed on it. The silence in the room deepened, becoming heavy, expectant. The handle turned. The door swung inward with a soft, expensive click. 2 men entered first. They were broad, silent, and dressed in identical dark suits that did nothing to hide the fact that they were built of stone and steel. They moved with an unnerving economy of motion, their eyes sweeping the room, once assessing and dismissing everyone in it. They took up positions on either side of the doorway, standing at ease, but radiating an aura of lethal readiness. Then she walked in. The world seemed to slow down. Time stretched, pulling thin like heated glass. It wasn't a CEO. It wasn't some tech billionaire in a hoodie or a Wall Street titan in pinstripes. It was Elizabeth Vance, but it wasn't the Elizabeth they knew. Not the frail, quiet widow who shuffled through the halls of the Brookline mansion in cashmere cardigans. Not the grieving, vacant woman Chloe had so easily dismissed. This woman was an entirely different creature. She wore a bespoke power suit of dark charcoal grey, tailored to perfection. It was a suit that wasn't just worn, it was wielded. Her silver hair was not soft and grandmotherly, but styled into a severe, elegant chignon that highlighted the sharp, intelligent lines of her face. She held no purse, no briefcase. Her hands were empty, her posture ramrod straight. Her gaze was not vacant or sad. It was a blade, cold, sharp, and absolutely commanding. She walked past her security detail and moved toward the head of the table with a calm, deliberate stride that consumed the space that owned it. A collective intake of breath was the only sound in the room. Arthur Sterling's jaw went slack. Julian Croft looked as if he'd seen a ghost. And Chloe. Chloe froze. Her face became a mask of concrete, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. Her mind, usually a high-speed processor of strategy and leverage, simply shut down. It was a blue screen of absolute paralyzing disbelief. This was impossible. A glitch in reality. A waking nightmare. The frail old woman, here dressed like that, looking like that. Elizabeth reached the head of the table where Chloe stood, as if rooted to the floor. She didn't stop. She simply looked at Chloe, her expression unreadable, but for the faint, chilling glint of something that might have been amusement in her eyes. It was the look a biologist gives a specimen under a microscope just before dissection. Chloe, on instinct, took a half step back, yielding the space, yielding the power. Elizabeth slid into the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table. Her chair. She placed her hands flat on the polished obsidian, her fingers spread, claiming her throne. The silence stretched for another 5, 10, 15 seconds. It was a weapon in her hands. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was not the thin, reedy whisper of an old woman. It was clear, strong, and resonated with an authority that seemed to shake the very glass of the windows. "Good morning," she began, her eyes sweeping over the stunned faces of the senior partners before finally landing with crushing weight on Chloe. "Ms. Vance." She used the name like a surgical instrument, creating a sudden, formal distance that was more intimate and insulting than any curse. "I am Elizabeth Vance, Chairwoman and Chief Executive Officer of Aegis Solutions." She let the words hang in the air, a death sentence for Chloe S. ambitions. "Thank you," Elizabeth continued, her voice dropping a fraction, becoming even more precise, more deadly. "For holding my seat." She paused, letting the full, horrifying implication of that statement sink in. Chloe's mind was screaming. Aegis Solutions. Her client. Her ticket. It was Elizabeth. It had always been Elizabeth. The trap hadn't it just been set. Chloe had walked into it, built it herself, and then celebrated her own execution. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. The faint hint of amusement was gone, replaced by a look of pure glacial focus. Now, she said, her voice dropping to a conversational tone that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "Let S talk about your subpar performance." The dissection began. It wasn't an attack. It was a deconstruction. A systematic surgical dismantling of a human being performed with the calm, unfeeling precision of a master. Elizabeth didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were scalpels, and she wielded them with an expertise that was terrifying to behold. She turned her gaze from Chloe to Arthur Sterling. "Mr. Sterling. In the initial proposal for the acquisition of Omnigen, your firm, under the guidance of Ms. Vance, suggested a leverage ratio of 6-1 for the buyout loan. A number predicated on a 7% quarterly growth projection for the target company." She paused. Arthur swallowed, his face pale. "Did anyone on your team?" Elizabeth continued, her eyes sweeping the room. "Think to stress test that projection against the new federal regulations on data sovereignty that passed the Senate subcommittee last Tuesday. Regulations I personally helped draft through a proxy think tank 3 years ago." Silence. Blank stares. "No, I thought not. Your model is built on sand. A single market fluctuation, a single regulatory hurdle, and the entire structure would have collapsed, taking Aegis S capital with it. This isn't just incompetence. It's negligence on a scale that borders on malpractice. She shifted her attention to Julian Croft. Mr. Croft. The due diligence report on OmniGen S intellectual property portfolio. It's thin? She gestured vaguely with one hand. You missed 3 shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands holding key patents that OmniGen merely licenses. A fact that a simple cross-reference of international patent filings would have revealed. Had we proceeded, we would have been buying a hollowed-out shell. Was your team lazy or simply out of their depth? Julian opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to say. He'd been checked and checkmated. Then Elizabeth turned her full, undivided attention back to Chloe. The air crackled. This was the main event. And you, Chloe. The use of her first name now felt like a violation. Your ambition has always outpaced your caution. It's your most glaring weakness. Chloe's throat was dry. She tried to speak to defend herself. That's not... The data was what I allowed you to see. Elizabeth cut in smoothly, her voice a silken razor. You get sloppy when you believe you've already won. You always have. Elizabeth leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto Chloe S. You did the same thing with that zoning variance case for the waterfront development back in 2023. You were so certain the councilman was in your pocket that you filed for a commercial use injunction when the opposition's entire strategy was based on environmental impact. A simple public records search would have shown you their expert witness list. You filed the wrong motion. You lost. Your firm billed the client for your failure, of course. A tidy sum. Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. How could she know that it was a minor case years ago? A detail buried in her work history. Or what about the McGregor deposition? Elizabeth went on, her voice relentless. You were so proud of how you cornered him on the stand. But you were so focused on his personal life that you completely missed the significance of the email chain his assistant produced. The one with the altered timestamps. You had proof of securities fraud right there in your hands, and you let it go, because you were too busy enjoying the spectacle of a man's humiliation. It cost your client a 7-figure settlement they should have won. Each word was a perfectly aimed dart, striking a nerve Chloe didn't even know was exposed. These weren't just professional critiques. They were personal, intimate dissections of her character, her flaws, her deepest insecurities, all laid bare in front of the men she so desperately wanted to impress. The senior partners were no longer looking at her. They were staring at Elizabeth, their expressions a mixture of awe and terror. They were witnessing the execution of one of their own, and they were powerless to stop it. Chloe's composure, her iron-clad professional mask, began to crack. Then it shattered. A tremor started in her hands. Her breathing became shallow. She opened her mouth, but only a strangled squeak emerged. You don't understand, Elizabeth finished for her, her voice devoid of any pity. You looked at me, and you saw a frail old woman, a relic, an obstacle to be managed and discarded. She shook her head slowly, a gesture of profound disappointment. You saw the vase on the mantelpiece. You never once thought to ask who built the house. Elizabeth stood up, her movement fluid and powerful. She was no longer just the CEO. She was the architect, the true matriarch. The queen who had been silent on the board for decades, watching, waiting. Your strategy is flawed. Your due diligence is a catastrophe. And your leadership. She looked directly at Chloe, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was louder than any shout, is a liability I will no longer tolerate. She turned to Sterling and Croft, who straightened in their chairs like schoolboys before a fearsome headmistress. My team will be here within the hour to salvage this acquisition. They will be taking over this boardroom. You will provide them with every file, every password, every shred of data you have. Your firm continued, and very lucrative relationship with Aegis Solutions depends on your absolute and immediate cooperation. She didn't wait for an answer. She knew she would get it. Then she looked back at Chloe one last time. Chloe was visibly trembling now, her face pale and slick with a cold sweat. She was no longer a shark. She was a fish flopping on the deck, gasping for air. Elizabeth said nothing more to her. She didn't have to. With a final dismissive glance, she turned and walked out of the boardroom, her two silent guards falling into step behind her. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving behind a silence filled with the smoking ruins of a career, an ambition, and a life. The drive back to Brookline was silent. Elizabeth sat in the back of her black sedan, watching the city blur past. She felt no elation, no joy. Only the cold, grim satisfaction of a necessary task completed. It was a cauterization, a painful but essential act to stop the spread of a disease. When her phone buzzed, she didn't flinch. She knew who it was. The caller ID flashed Daniel. She answered, her voice perfectly level. Yes. Mom Daniel's voice was a ragged explosion of fury and disbelief. He was shouting, "Mom, what the hell is going on? What did you do? Chloe just got home. She's a wreck. She said you were at her office, that you were the CEO of Aegis. What kind of sick game is this?" Elizabeth listened to his frantic, panicked tirade, her expression unchanged. He was weak, always so weak, so easily manipulated. By his father, by his wife. He saw only the surface, the immediate disruption to his comfortable life. He couldn't see the rot underneath. "It isn't a game, Daniel," she said, her voice dropping to a blade of ice. It cut through his anger, silencing him instantly. "I am cleaning up a mess." "A mess? What mess?" "You humiliated my wife. You destroyed her in front of her bosses. That deal was everything to us." "No, Daniel," Elizabeth corrected him, her tone final. "You don't understand. I am cleaning up your father's mess." She didn't elaborate. She didn't explain. She simply delivered the line like a judge passing sentence. Then, before he could respond, before he could muster another word of his useless rage, she ended the call. The click was deafening in the quiet car. For a moment, she sat perfectly still. This was the next step. The most painful one. The one she had dreaded for years but knew was unavoidable. She pulled out her personal phone, the encrypted one that connected her to the real world. Her fingers, steady and sure, moved across the screen. She navigated to a secure file, a single high-resolution photograph. It was a page from a book, an old ledger, its paper yellowed with age. The entry was handwritten in Richard S.'s familiar, arrogant script. It was a line item dated October 1997. It noted a payment, a substantial one, to a shell corporation. Next to it in the memo line were two words: Thorn. Final. And beneath it, a name, Marcus Thorn. And at the very bottom of the page, a signature she knew as well as her own. Richard Vance. With a single decisive tap, she sent the image to Daniel. No text, no explanation, just the photograph. The truth in black and white. She put the phone away and looked out the window. The mess wasn't just Chloe's ambition or Daniel's weakness. It was a half-century of secrets and sins. It was time to burn it all down. Daniel stared at his phone, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and rage. Your father's mess. What did that even mean? He was pacing the length of their cavernous living room, the phone clutched in his hand like a weapon. He was ready to call back, to scream, to demand answers. Chloe was upstairs, her muffled sobs, the soundtrack to his unraveling world. His mother, his quiet, fragile mother, had become a monster. His phone buzzed in his hand. A notification. A message from Mom. He opened it. It wasn't a text. It was an image. He squinted, his anger giving way to confusion. It looked like a page from an old accounting book. He saw his father S handwriting the familiar loops and sharp angles. He saw dates, numbers. Then his eyes found the name. Marcus Thorne. The name hit him like a physical blow. Chloe S. father. The journalist who had vanished without a trace when she was a teenager. The ghost that had haunted the edges of their entire relationship. Then he read the memo. Thorne. Final. Final. His gaze dropped to the bottom of the page, to the signature. Richard Vance. The world tilted on its axis. The floor fell away. The air rushed from his lungs. Wasn't it a forgery? He knew that signature better than he knew his own face. It was real. Final. The word echoed in the sudden vast silence of his mind. Final payment? Final solution? The pieces clicked into place with the sickening, grinding finality of a crypt door sealing shut. His father, his revered, powerful, untouchable father, had paid to have Chloe S. father murdered. His mother hadn't humiliated Chloe, she had armed him. He stumbled through the house, his legs unsteady, the phone gripped in a white-knuckled fist. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst into their bedroom. Chloe was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands. Her power suit from the morning was rumpled, her makeup smeared. She looked broken. Chloe, he breathed, his voice hoarse. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Daniel. He didn't let her finish. He shoved the phone in front of her face. What is this? He demanded, his voice trembling. He was desperate. He needed her to deny it. To call it a lie, a cruel trick by a vindictive old woman. He needed her to be the victim. Chloe stared at the screen. Her sobbing stopped. The brokenness in her eyes receded, replaced by something else. Something cold and hard. A flicker of an expression he had never seen before. Recognition. But not surprise. Chloe, he said again, his voice cracking. Tell me it is not real. Tell me this is a lie. She looked up from the phone, her gaze meeting his. The last remnants of the weeping, shattered woman evaporated. In her place was a stranger, a woman with eyes like chips of flint. She let out a short, sharp, mirthless laugh. It was the ugliest sound he had ever heard. A lie, she whispered, her voice laced with a venom that had been brewing for 2 decades. Oh, Daniel. The lie is you. The lie is this house. This marriage. What are you talking about? She stood up, her posture changing. The slump of defeat was gone, replaced by a rigid, hateful strength. My father, Marcus Thorne. He was an investigative journalist, a good one. He was working on a story in the late 90s, a story about a ruthless corporate raider who built his empire on insider trading, intimidation, and ruin. A man named Richard Vance. Daniel felt a wave of nausea. No. Yes, she hissed. He was getting close. Too close. And then he disappeared? Vanished? The police found nothing. The trail went cold. But I never stopped looking. I was a kid, but I wasn't a stupid. I knew. I always knew it was your father. The confession poured out of her a torrent of long-suppressed poison. I spent years digging. I went to law school, clawed my way into the right circles, all for one reason: to get close to the Vances, to find the proof, to find a way inside. She took a step toward him, her eyes burning with a righteous fire. And then I found you, the perfect way in, the weak link. So eager to please, so desperate for a strong woman to tell you what to do, just like your father wanted. You were so easy, Daniel. So pathetically easy. His world wasn't shattering anymore. It was gone. It had never existed. Their life together, their love, their marriage. It was all a tactic, a strategy, a long, calculated revenge scheme. Everything he choked out, All of it. It was all a plan. She spat the word. I was going to infiltrate your family. I was going to get my hands on the company, on the money. I was going to ruin you. I was going to take everything your father built and burn it to the goddamn ground as payback for what he did to mine. She gestured wildly around the opulent bedroom. This was all supposed to be my victory, my justice. A dark, twisted smile touched her lips. It was a horrifying sight, but I never knew, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a shared moment of utter destruction. In all my years of planning, in all my digging, I never knew the real monster wasn't your father. She looked him dead in the eye, the two of them two enemies, trapped in the wreckage of their lives. It was your mother. The digital ticker on Elizabeth's main screen turned from amber to a solid, confident green. A single word appeared in stark white font against the black interface, executed. It was done. The final hostile acquisition of OmniGen Dynamics was complete. The legal machinery, meticulously set in motion by Chloe herself, had ground to its inevitable perfect conclusion. The conglomerate she had envisioned, the one she believed would be her crowning achievement, now belonged entirely to Aegis Solutions, which meant it belonged entirely to Elizabeth. For a moment the room was silent, save for the low hum of the servers. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of 50 years of ambition, of whispered strategies and ruthless calculations. Richard would have celebrated. He would have poured 2 glasses of scotch and toasted to another fallen king. But Elizabeth felt no triumph, only the cold, clean feeling of a slate about to be wiped. She turned her chair away from the screens, her gaze finding Mia, who stood near the disguised bookshelf entrance. Her expression, a mixture of awe and trepidation. She had seen the boardroom takedown via a secure feed. She had heard the phone call that shattered her father. She had watched her grandmother, the quiet, frail woman who read novels in the sunroom, reveal herself as a titan. The takeover is complete, Elizabeth said, her voice even devoid of emotion. It was a statement of fact, not a declaration of victory. Mia nodded slowly. So, what happens now? Do you run it? The question hung in the air, filled with the impossible weight of a multi-billion-dollar global entity. Elizabeth offered a faint, sad smile. An empire, Mia, is just a bigger, more ornate cage. Your grandfather built one. I helped him design it. I will not live in another. And I will not leave one for you. She gestured to the main console. Come here. Mia walked over her sneakers, silent on the polished floor. Elizabeth's screen was no longer displaying stock tickers or acquisition data. It was now a file directory, a labyrinth of folders nested within one another, each with a cryptic designation. Project Nightingale, Medusa Protocol, the Damascus Brief. These were the foundational sins of the Vance Empire. Your grandfather was a brilliant frontman, Elizabeth said, her eyes fixed on the screen. But he was a terrible archivist. He kept everything: receipts, memos, encrypted recordings, evidence of every bribe, every blackmail, every life he ruined to build this house. Her finger traced the air in front of a folder labeled Thorn M, including your mother's father. Mia's breath hitched, but she said nothing. She was beginning to understand. This wasn't about winning. This was about something else entirely. Power like this should not exist. Elizabeth continued, her voice gaining a steely edge. It doesn't just corrupt. It metastasizes. It poisons everything it touches. The person who wields it, their family, the world around them. I watched it happen for 50 years. I will not let it continue for one more day. She looked at Mia, her eyes clear and sharp. The frail grandmother was gone forever. In her place was a general giving her final order. I have collated and decrypted every last file, every piece of damning evidence. It is packaged into 7 separate data caches, each one watermarked for a different recipient. The Associated Press, the Wall Street Journal, the BBC, the SEC, the International Criminal Court. Each cache is a key, but none of them is the whole story. Only when they all report it will the full picture emerge. You want me to... Mia started, her eyes wide. I want you to burn it all to the ground. Elizabeth finished for her. Anonymously. Irrevocably. You will use a multi-layered VPN routed through servers in a dozen non-extradition countries. The signal will bounce from Brazil to Moldova to the Seychelles before it ever reaches its destination. They will hunt for the source. They will call it the leak of the century. But they will never find you. They will be looking for a disgruntled employee, a rival operative. They will never think to look for a 16-year-old girl in a mansion in Brookline, Massachusetts, acting on the orders of her grandmother. Mia stared at the screen at the list of files that represented a half-century of darkness. It was a legacy of pain and power. And her grandmother was asking her to be the one to press the delete button on history itself. They will come for you, Mia whispered. When they figure it out, they'll blame you. Let them, Elizabeth said, her voice softening just a fraction. They can take the money. They can take the houses, the reputation. I am giving it all away. What I am buying back is more valuable. Mia looked from the screen to her grandmother's face. She saw the lines of exhaustion, the deep, abiding sorrow, but underneath it all, a powerful, unwavering resolve. This was Elizabeth's true endgame. Not a queen's gambit to win the board, but a move to shatter the board itself. Show me the protocol, Mia said, her voice firm. She pulled a chair up to the console, her own resolve hardening. She was a Vance, after all. And this was a new kind of inheritance. For the next hour, they worked in tandem. A strange, silent partnership between the architect of the empire and its chosen demolitions expert. Elizabeth pointed to the encrypted packets. Mia wrote the short, elegant script that would disperse them. There was no hesitation. The code was clean. The targets were locked. Finally, a single dialogue box appeared on the screen. It was simple, almost anticlimactic. Execute phoenixfall.bat. YN. Mia's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She looked at Elizabeth one last time. Elizabeth simply nodded. A final, silent permission. Mia pressed Y and hit enter. A green progress bar shot across the screen. Uploading. 10%, 45%, 87%. Then a new word. Complete. And a final one. Scrubbing origin. Complete. The data was gone. Sent out into the world like a virus ready to infect the global nervous system. Elizabeth reached out and placed her hand over Mia's. Her skin was cool, almost papery, but her grip was firm. It's done, she said. And then the world outside their silent room began to break. The first tremor hit the financial news networks. A sudden, unexplained halt in trading for all stocks linked to the newly formed Aegis Omnigen conglomerate. Then came the first headline, a tentative push notification from Reuters. Source claims massive data leak from shadowy conglomerate Aegis Solutions. Within an hour, it was no longer a tremor. It was an earthquake. The Associated Press dropped its story detailing political bribery on a global scale. The Wall Street Journal followed, exposing decades of market manipulation, corporate sabotage, and illegal surveillance. The BBC's report focused on the human cost, with names and dates of ruined careers, blackmailed politicians, and suspicious accidents. Social media ignited. Aegis scandal became the #1 trending topic worldwide. Every news channel from CNN to Al Jazeera led with the same story. The empire Elizabeth had built in the shadows was now exposed in the brightest, most unforgiving light imaginable. For Chloe, the end came not with a bang, but with the chillingly polite tone of her firm's managing partner, Jonathan Croft. She was in her office, her own screen filled with the same cascading headlines that were consuming the world. Her phone was a constant vibrating brick of terror. She had been trying to call Daniel, to call Elizabeth, to call anyone, but no one was answering. Jonathan didn't knock. He entered her office and closed the door softly behind him. Two other senior partners, a man and a woman she had revered, stood with him. Their faces were granite. Chloe Jonathan began his voice, leaving no room for argument. "You brought this company into our house. Jonathan!" "I had no idea," she stammered, rising from her chair. "This is Elizabeth, my mother-in-law. She's had some kind of breakdown. It's a vendetta. We have a team of forensic accountants and cybersecurity experts in the boardroom right now." The female partner, Sarah, cut her off, her voice like ice. "They are tracing the origin of the shell corporation Aegis Solutions, the one you personally vouched for. The one you assured us was the opportunity of a lifetime. Every digital footprint, every financial transaction leads back to assets controlled by the Vance family. Your family. I was a victim in this, just like you." Chloe pleaded, her voice rising with hysteria. The cool, calculating shark lawyer was gone, replaced by a desperate woman watching her life burn down. Jonathan just shook his head slowly. "The Bar Association has already been in contact. So has the SEC. There will be a federal investigation. Sterling Croft will cooperate fully, but you will not be a part of it." He placed a cardboard box on her desk. It was empty. "Your access has been revoked. Security will escort you out. Please, for the sake of whatever dignity you have left, do not make a scene." She stared at the box, then at their faces. There was no sympathy, no mercy. She was a liability, a disease they were cutting out before it could spread. As she was walked through the bullpen, past the dozens of associates and paralegals who had once feared and admired her, she could feel their eyes on her. She heard the whispers. She saw the pity and the scorn on their faces. Her phone buzzed again. An email notification. The subject line was stark. "Notice of disbarment proceedings." Her career, the entire edifice of her identity, had been demolished in less than 3 hours. For Daniel, the collapse was more intimate, more poisonous. He was in the grand library of the Brookline mansion, a place that had always felt more like a museum than a home. A bottle of his father's best whiskey was on the table, half empty. The television was on the volume muted, but the images were inescapable. His father's face, Richard Vance, next to headlines that called him a monster, a criminal, a puppeteer who had manipulated world events for profit. His name. The Vance name. It wasn't a legacy anymore. It was a stain. He'd tried calling Chloe a dozen times. Her betrayal was a wound deeper than anything his mother had done. His mother was a warrior, a monster of a different kind. He could almost understand her actions as a form of scorched earth strategy. But Chloe had been his wife. Their life, their marriage, he now realized, was the longest con in history. She hadn't married him. She had infiltrated him. He heard a noise from the foyer and looked up. It was Chloe dragging a suitcase behind her. Her face was pale, tear-streaked, but her eyes were filled with a venom that matched his own. "You!" He spat the word thick with whiskey and hate. "Dante, you dare!" she hissed, dropping the handle of her suitcase. It fell to the marble floor with a loud thud. "Dante, you dare look at me like that! Your mother did this. Your sainted, perfect mother. My mother reacted to you." He roared, getting to his feet, the chair clattering behind him. "You tried to have her declared incompetent. You tried to steal her money and throw her in a home. You were going to do it to the woman who gave me life." Chloe let out a sharp, bitter laugh that held no humor. "Gave you life, Daniel. You haven't been alive a day in your life. You were a ghost, a shadow living off a dead man's reputation." A reputation, it turns out, that was built on murder and lies. And you knew he shot back, stalking towards her. You knew what my father did. You knew about your own father. And you never said a word. You married me. You slept in my bed in this house, knowing it was paid for with your father's blood. Of course I knew, she said, her voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. The mask was completely off now. All that was left was the raw, festering core of her hatred. I found out years ago. I spent every day of our marriage thinking about it. Every time you touched me, every time I had to smile at your pathetic family dinners, I was thinking about him, Marcus Thorne, a journalist who got too close to your father as dirty little secrets. So Richard had him disappeared, paid to have him silenced forever. Her eyes bored into his. I didn't want the Vance money, you idiot. I wanted to burn the Vance name to ash. I was going to take everything from your mother, dismantle your father's legacy piece by piece, and leave you with nothing. She just beat me to it. She was always one step ahead. The confession hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was the complete negation of his entire adult life. His marriage, his love, his partnership. It was all a lie. A weapon aimed at his family from the very beginning. He looked at her, at this stranger standing in his foyer, and felt nothing but a vast, hollow emptiness. Get out, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Gladly, she sneered, picking up her suitcase. Enjoy your ruin. She walked out the front door, slamming it behind her. The sound echoed through the cavernous house, a final, definitive period on a sentence of lies. Daniel sank back into his chair, the muted television flashing images of his family as disgrace across his vacant face. He had lost his wife, his fortune, his name, and his past, all in one day. He was well and truly alone. Elizabeth stood in that same library hours later. The television was off. The whiskey bottle was gone. The house was utterly silent. It was the silence of a tomb. Her phone, which had been buzzing non-stop with calls from lawyers, bankers, and panicked former associates, now lay quiet on a side table. There was only one call she had been waiting for. It came just after midnight. She picked it up. Daniel? His voice on the other end was not angry or yelling. It was something far worse. It was hollow, broken. The voice of a man who had been completely hollowed out. It's all gone, he said, his words flat. Everything. Chloe, the money, the name. It's all just gone. I know, Elizabeth replied softly. Why, he asked, a flicker of pained confusion in his voice. Why would you do it? Why burn it all down? It was our family. Elizabeth closed her eyes. This was the price. She knew it would be. The knife-s edge of her decision. She had freed herself, but in doing so, she had severed the final bond with her son. It was a prison, Daniel, she said, her voice weighted with the sorrow of 50 years. It was built by your father, and it was killing us all slowly. I had to tear it down. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Daniel spoke, his voice so quiet she could barely hear it. You didn't just tear it down. You destroyed me with it. The line went dead. Elizabeth held the phone for a moment longer before placing it back in its cradle. She did not cry. Her tears had run dry decades ago. She simply stood in the silent library in the heart of her fallen empire and absorbed the cost of her victory. She had lost her son. She had lost the family she had fought in her own twisted way to protect for half a century. She had won, and she was utterly alone. The sun was warm, the air filled with the salty tang of the Mediterranean and the distant, cheerful chatter from a nearby cafe. Months had passed. The chaos of the Aegis scandal had faded from a roaring inferno to a steady, smouldering fire that still dominated financial news cycles. But here, on this sun-drenched balcony, in a small, unnamed coastal town in Portugal, It was just background noise. Elizabeth sat in a simple wicker chair, a book resting unread in her lap. She wasn't the titan of industry or the frail matriarch anymore. She was just a woman in a linen dress, her grey hair pulled back loosely. Her face relaxed in a way it hadn't been in 50 years. She seemed smaller, yet lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Mia came out onto the balcony, carrying 2 glasses of fresh lemonade. She placed one on the small table next to her grandmother. She had changed too. The guarded, tech-savvy teenager had been replaced by a young woman with a quiet confidence in her eyes. The secrets she kept were no longer a burden, but a bond. From inside the small apartment, the sound of a television drifted out. A news anchor, with a British accent, was giving an update. The fallout continues as prosecutors in 3 countries bring new charges against former executives of the defunct Aegis conglomerate. Disgraced lawyer Chloe Thorne remains under investigation, while Daniel Vance, heir to the ruined fortune, has reportedly been admitted to a private wellness facility in Switzerland. Mia glanced towards the sound, then looked at her grandmother. Elizabeth's expression didn't change. She just watched the waves roll in and out a steady, endless rhythm. "Do you ever miss it?" Mia asked quietly. The house. The power. Elizabeth considered the question for a moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I miss the idea of what it was supposed to be," she said softly. "A home. A family. But it never was. It was a fortress. And I was its longest-serving prisoner." Mia sat down in the chair opposite her. She watched the woman who had orchestrated the rise and fall of an empire, who had sacrificed everything: her son, her legacy, her fortune for a principle. Was it worth it? Mia asked, her voice barely a whisper, the question she had been holding on to for months. Losing all of it. Elizabeth finally turned her head away from the sea. She looked at her granddaughter, the only piece of her old life she had chosen to bring into the new one. And for the first time, a smile touched her lips. It was not the thin, strategic smile of the past. It was small, but it was genuine. It reached her eyes, which shone with a light that looked like peace. "Freedom," she said, her voice clear and sure against the gentle roar of the ocean. "Freedom always is,